Welcome back to Texas versus the SEC. This is On Texas Football. Gerry Hamilton, I'm CJ Vogel. Jerry, we're here at week 6. Texas has a bye, but for the most part, everybody in the SEC this weekend will be playing their second or third game in the conference so far. Of course, Texas sitting at 1-0. We've already seen some unraveling in the conference, obviously, with Ole Miss losing to Kentucky a week ago, Georgia and Alabama duking it out last week as well. This weekend will be no different. As we know, the SEC is a bit of a gauntlet, and each week separates the pretenders from the contenders, and that's exactly what we're going to be going over today. Who's serious about winning the SEC conference championship game, and who is not? Jerry, real quick, we've seen a few, 5-6 games for each team so far this year. This is probably the beginning of the nitty-gritty scheduling-wise for every team in the conference.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, and I know the first one we're going to talk about is the two teams that are playing this weekend that have the easiest schedules remaining in the SEC. No doubt about it if you look at it. But, it's going to be interesting how we kind of where we sit these teams in pretenders versus the contenders. And obviously we're going to start with the contenders first, but last weekend really was big because Ole Miss, nobody on the bingo card had Ole Miss losing at home to Kentucky. And that was after Kentucky almost upset Georgia. And I think most people thought Georgia beat Bama, but it was still a toss-up game because it was in Tuscaloosa. But I think now that we're seeing what teams look like in the SEC, it's also a clearer picture on whose schedule looks really good to remain a contender after this week, this weekend, and then next week in Dallas, by the way. Whose schedule looks like a contender and who said, man, they're up against it. They may actually be a pretender.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about in the past teams that are starting to look a little bit more difficult. Some Arkansas, some Kentuckys, maybe a Vanderbilt on that schedule as well, versus teams that maybe aren't as formidable as we thought coming into the year, starting with Oklahoma. We could talk about LSU a little bit later. But, Jerry, talking about that first game that we wanted to get to, it's the only top 25 game on the slate this weekend. And to me, this is an absolute loser leaves town type of game in terms of who's serious about contending for the SEC championship game. Number 9, Missouri, heads down to College Station to face number 25, Texas A&M. And to your point, the winner of this is set up very nicely to make a nice run at what could be a trip to Atlanta at the end of the year. On the other hand, the loser, well, they got some answers to get up and answer to right away. Right now, I think Missouri comes away with the victory here, but at the end of the day, you don't know right now as we film this today.
Yeah, no, I think it's a toss-up game, honestly. I think that's where the line's pretty much at, slightly favoring A&M at home. But I want to say this. Now the way the schedules have shaken out, A&M has the easiest conference schedule remaining, or the most favorable. Nobody's easy, most favorable. If they beat Missouri, all that's left for them is at Mississippi State, terrible team, LSU at home game, LSU's an injured team, but managing to win at South Carolina, at Auburn. Those are difficult games, but then Texas at home. And still, even with that said, that schedule, when you put it up against the rest of the SEC, is the easiest schedule remaining of the teams that we think could be contenders. And you're only a contender if you win this game. Then you go to Missouri. And Missouri, if they win this game, obviously they have Auburn, but they still have to go to Alabama. Then they have Oklahoma at home, at South Carolina, at Mississippi State, and Arkansas. So the winner of this game is a real contender because the way their schedule sets up. Now, at Alabama is a tough game for Missouri, but one loss, if you beat A&M, if you can navigate the rest of that schedule, then one loss puts you right there in contention, right? So they're a contender. Both these teams, I think, have to win to remain a contender. If you lose, you're probably going to move to the pretenders because you do have road games and tough games left coming up. But the winner of this game, A&M and Missouri, and A&M's already 2-0 in the conference. If A&M gets a 3-0 in the conference, with what's remaining for them at Mississippi State, probably win, get you to 4-0. You're 4-0 when LSU comes to town. They're a contender.
Absolutely. And, of course, if A&M were to win this game, they have a bye week ahead. And then you look at who they have to go on the road against. At Mississippi State, at South Carolina, at Auburn. South Carolina and Auburn, tough places to play. But right now, you don't look at either of those teams as true contenders in the conference. South Carolina coming back with Lenore Sellers and Rocket Lenore Sellers and Rocket Sanders back in their backfield, they could pose as a tough team to play against. But in the big picture of all of this, not necessarily a team that you would expect to be in this conversation for teams that go to Atlanta. But about Missouri, I mean, they've not yet passed the eye test, right? When it comes to teams that you look at, playing at Boston College, playing against Vanderbilt, it took an overtime win and, kind of one of those last second holds from your defense to win by 6 points against Boston College. Listen, they've not lived up to that top 10 expectation coming into the year. This would be a big statement win for them if they were able to leave College Station with the victory. I lean pretender for both teams at the moment, but to your point and to the point that we were trying to make here, the winner certainly sets up very favorably for the remainder of the season there. To the second game of the SEC slate this weekend, that really has a lot of implications. And I think one team specifically here that we're looking at in the contender stage right now is Ole Miss, coming off the loss to Kentucky. It was not necessarily one that they could afford to lose and still have the big hopes for the SEC or a playoff berth here. But now you got to go on the road to South Carolina. And as I mentioned, they're getting some health back with their quarterback, Lenore Sellers. Ole Miss, I think, firmly in the pretenders category at the moment.
Yeah, I think they're a pretender now as well with that loss, because at South Carolina this weekend, obviously we'll see if Sellers can play. I think he was listed as questionable. But then you go to LSU. Then you have Oklahoma at home. Then you go to Arkansas. Then you have Georgia at home. You go to Florida, Mississippi State. So the last two is pretty good because you don't know what Florida is going to look like at that point in the season. But that's the 4 road games left for them now. So the home loss is really – that one really stings Ole Miss as far as contention in the SEC. I list them as a pretender for sure because they just don't have any margin for error left. And you have no margin for error with 4 road games left, plus Oklahoma and Georgia at home. That's a bad spot to be with no room for error.
Yeah, absolutely is. And with the way that we thought that Ole Miss would be playing football this year, they put so much time and emphasis in the trenches, and it didn't necessarily show up against Kentucky, right? It felt like Jackson Dart was running for his life a lot of the time, and you thought with what they were able to add out of the portal, that would be a big benefit for them, and it hasn't shown up so far.
They certainly didn't have the offense Texas has. That's the big takeaway from me. For me, that game is, look, and maybe Kentucky holds Texas down too, right, in Austin. I doubt it's going to be like that. Ole Miss offensively did not have the firepower they were expected to have in that game. And I know Kentucky is good on defense, and I know Georgia only scored 12, but that's a home game after Georgia was held to 12, and you had supreme focus on that game for the Ole Miss team, and they just couldn't score the football at a high enough rate. And that is going to be – and that's an issue now with 4 games on the road.
Yeah, of course. Those are the 2 kind of marquee conference games to keep an eye on this week. Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, they all play this weekend as well. But, Jerry, I wanted to get your thoughts about Texas because as they enter the bye week, they'll come out of it facing the 2 back-to-back toughest games on the entire schedule with Oklahoma in Dallas and Georgia at home. But at the moment, so far, so good. 5 games, 5 22-plus point victories for the Longhorns. They're top 10 in both offense and defense efficiency. Right now, Texas is rolling. I think we both would agree they're firmly in that contenders category for the SEC title.
Yeah, they are. And look, if they win next Saturday against Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl, then, you have a game to play with and you're still a contender, right? That's a huge game as far as SEC race for Texas goes. If you drop that one before Georgia comes to Austin, and then you still have Kentucky and you still have the road game at Arkansas and A&M, that looks a little tougher. So it's kind of in the SEC race. I think Saturday is kind of a must win. And so Texas fans must win, period. We're just talking about the SEC race here. But look, their schedule's a little tougher than A&M when you consider A&M doesn't have Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, or Ole Miss on their schedule this year. I mean, that's a pretty favorable schedule. Obviously, Texas has the Georgia game, and the A&M Arkansas game is neutral, and Texas goes to A&M and to Arkansas. So Texas a little bit tougher schedule there, but the Oklahoma game looms very large for Texas. And the other reason it looms large for Texas is the Texas offense has firepower and they're explosive and they're really good. You showed you that at Michigan. If they go neutral site and do that to Oklahoma with a week to prepare for Oklahoma, then the rest of the SEC teams are going to be, man, Texas offense is legitimately probably the best in the league. I mean, that's what people are going to be thinking.
I think that's a really interesting point because we already saw it against what was a pretty star-studded defense on the road in Michigan, and that was even with taking the foot off the gas in that second half a little bit when that game wasn't necessarily close towards the end. But sticking with Texas and who they have to play coming out of the Oklahoma week, Georgia. They go. They host Auburn this weekend. They're coming off of the loss, obviously, a week ago to Alabama. First and foremost, were we kind of looking at the result of that game as they're both still contenders? They're, Alabama's still undefeated. They're up to number 1 in the country. I think they're firmly in that stage. But Georgia, I think that's an interesting game. You play at home the next 2 games, Auburn and Mississippi State. You should take care of both of those games. Then you go on the road to Texas. You have a bye week. You come out. You face Florida at home. Then you go to Oxford to play Ole Miss, play Tennessee, and then Georgia Tech at the end. It's not a smooth sailing, ship, if you will, for Georgia till the end of the road.
I think they're a pretender now. I mean, and I know Georgia fans will get mad at it, and Texas fans are, you an idiot? But look, they have no margin for error left. I mean, that's the thing. They can't lose another game now on the schedule and be a true contender in the SEC, in my opinion. If that happens and everybody has 2 losses, it's straight up chaos, and nobody don't even know who to go. Everybody's going to be pointing at each other. But at Texas, at Ole Miss, and Tennessee left, I don't think they're done losing. So they get 2 losses in conference play, and I just don't see it for them. I think they're a pretender now after that game. And that doesn't mean they're not going to be in the college football playoff or they're not a really good team, but we're talking SEC championship game here. They're a pretender after that loss because of the schedule.
Now, would that have been the same case had Alabama lost at home last week to Georgia? Because, you start looking at who Alabama has to play. I think Vanderbilt, they should take care of business against Vanderbilt. However, I do think that is a big trap game for the Tide to come off of that emotional victory where everybody's talking about it's the game of the year. Vanderbilt's shown a pulse this year, right? They have a quarterback that can make magic out of nothing. I'm not saying they're going to lose that game, but it certainly isn't as, a large of a deficit as you would normally expect an Alabama-Vanderbilt game to be. Outside of that, South Carolina at Tennessee, Missouri at LSU, Mercer at Oklahoma, and then Auburn. That's not smooth sailing at all for the Tide either.
No, but that's why I think that was a huge win over Georgia. And I do think they'll mash Vanderbilt. I could see Vanderbilt keeping it close. It's a different discussion, but this is a 2 weeks. Vanderbilt has to keep Diego Pavia healthy for the rest of the season with Alabama and Kentucky back-to-back. But if they had lost that game, you would still have at Tennessee, at LSU, and at OU left, and Missouri at home. That would have been a much more difficult schedule. Now you have a game to play with. I think they're for sure a contender, and I think if they had lost that game, them and Georgia would be flipped. I think Georgia's got the tougher schedule versus Alabama, but because Alabama won that game, certainly a contender because they have the game to play with. But to your point, if they had lost, they'd have to be going to the pretender category again, because if everybody has 2 losses, nobody's going to know what's going to happen. But Alabama definitely on the list of contenders now with a schedule that has some difficulty, some landmines on the road, but with the big one being at Tennessee. But the question is with Oklahoma, at the end of the year, that road game with Oklahoma's offensive struggles doesn't look as tough as it did before the season for Alabama either.
Yeah, as we sit here filming this right now, there are 10 teams in the SEC that are either undefeated in conference play or have 1 loss. And, of course, as you sit here and start narrowing down that list down to 2, well, it doesn't get very easy, of course. And I start looking at it a little bit differently, right? Who can separate themselves to go on the road and win these games, and also whose teams kind of favorable schedule start standing out to them. We mentioned A&M has a favorable schedule. We mentioned Texas has a schedule that if they can get through these next 2 weeks, I'm not saying it's smooth sailing, but I'm certainly saying there are other teams that have much tougher roads ahead of them than what Texas has. Let me go through a few schools that we haven't yet talked about. I'm going to start with LSU real quick. This is a school that, hey, they squeaked out a win against South Carolina. I know they didn't look great against USC early in the week or early in the season, but they too are in their bye week right now. Then they come out, Ole Miss, at Arkansas, at A&M, Alabama, Florida, Vanderbilt, and then finish up with Oklahoma. Is there a chance that we're looking at maybe a season turnaround from the opening week to, hey, the Tigers are back in the SEC championship conversation?
I would say this. If LSU beats Ole Miss after their off week, that's an October 12th game. If they beat Ole Miss, because that means Ole Miss has played Kentucky at South Carolina before going to LSU. So that could be a beat-up, a little bit Ole Miss team. They have the longest injury report in the conference, if you believe Lane Kiffin, by the way. Then LSU has a pulse in this. The problem is they're at Alabama and they're at A&M. And you still have an at game at Florida. At Arkansas, at Alabama, at A&M. Then you have that's a tougher schedule for LSU. I think LSU's got a tough schedule. That's why I'm kind of there. I'm wait and see with them. If they beat Ole Miss, then they go to the contender stage, at least for a while. But it's hard to see that team that struggles defensively for me being a contender right now. They're really going to have to prove it on the defensive side of the ball, especially with the injuries they've had. I think that's going to be kind of the reason they end up being a pretender.
Yeah, I agree as well. That's with Harold Perkins. They lost their starting nose tackle out for the year as well. They've been up against the wall when it comes to the injury, certainly on the short side of the stick there. But, Jerry, going to the north side of the Red River, we haven't talked about Oklahoma just yet. They're on a bye week this week. But, man, we've talked about it coming into the year. They played 6 of the top 15 teams in the entire country to begin the year. And I think at some point a week ago, it was 5 of the top 7. That's not easy. Perhaps the toughest of anybody in the conference. Bad offensive line, hurt wide receivers, brand new quarterback. Screams pretender to me. I don't know about you, but this is one that I think that after a week or two from now, you can just write off Oklahoma completely.
Yeah, no, I haven't even considered them in this, so they're definitely a pretender for me. Just too tough of a schedule when you don't put points on the board. I mean, I don't know what to say, but you go to Missouri, you're gonna have to score to win that game. You have to score to beat. There's not a game that they play where you're like, okay, well, maybe if they get 14-17, they're definitely going to win that game. I don't see it. I mean, they had to scratch 27 with a pick 6 last week, right? And Auburn missed 2 field goals in that game and had 400 and something, 60, 70, 80 yards. So that's the problem for Oklahoma is you're sitting there saying as much as they struggle to score because of the offensive line and the receiver injuries, major stuff for them. Can they score enough to win this league and be a contender? Nah, not even a chance. They're a pretender. I think the next, CJ, where we're going next with Tennessee is a definite contender.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where I was going to go next. Of course, Tennessee, looking at them in the sense that you come off the bye after the win at Oklahoma. You go to Fayetteville this week. That could be a close test. I don't know. Fayetteville's a tougher team to play at home than away, but it should be a team that Tennessee comes away with a victory. And then you got to play Florida. Alabama at home is going to be massive for who, again, in the terms of, loser leaves town, essentially. That game in Rocky Top, that might be a game, Jerry, that I look at and say, all right, loser's gone. Winner moves on.
Yeah, they have an interesting schedule because if they navigate this week at Arkansas and with a week off, they're going to be fresh. That was a physical game against Oklahoma. So that was a perfect time for an off week. Arkansas coming off of another heartbreaking loss to A&M, right? So if Tennessee navigates that road game, their schedule actually sets up really good because they have Florida, Alabama, and Kentucky at home. And I'm not saying they definitely beat Alabama at home, but, man, even the last time Nick went up there, it was rough, right? So Tennessee's got – and then they have Mississippi State at home. So if Tennessee can navigate these next 5 games before they go to Georgia, they're right there. And in fact, if they navigate the next 5, they're probably going to be the favorite going to Georgia at that point in time. Ooh. That's where it gets interesting for Tennessee, and they end with at Vanderbilt. Obviously, we'll see if Diego Pavia, if they can keep him healthy at Vanderbilt at the end of the year. Definitely a contender. Even though Oklahoma's a pretender, that was still a quality road win for Tennessee. First ever SEC game for Oklahoma. They were jacked up. It was in Norman. And Tennessee, they pretty much ran that game. And even though the score at the end of the game may not have showed it, Tennessee was in control of that game the whole way. And if you can be in control of a road game against this Oklahoma defense, even though Oklahoma defense gave up some yards at Auburn. I think that's a really good sign for Tennessee. So if they stay relatively healthy, which they are now, if they navigate this Arkansas game this weekend, they got a really favorable schedule. They're definitely a contender.
So to recap, and I wanted to go over this real quick, the contenders that we believe to be in, contention for the SEC championship game, I think there's 4 with a little bit of an asterisk up there, right? Yep. Alabama, I think Tennessee, Texas, and then because of the schedules and how they line up favorably wise, the winner of Texas A&M and Missouri. Crazy to say, but there are paths for both of those schools to run the table after this game, considering who they have to play and where they have to play them. Who am I missing? Or is that kind of what we've narrowed it down to at the moment?
Yeah, I think LSU's kind of the wait and see. We don't think defensively they're going to be a contender at the end of the day, but that's why they play the games. If they beat Ole Miss October 12th, then you have to put them in the contender category until their defense proves you wrong. But I agree. That's where we're at. I mean, and that means we're leaving Georgia as a pretender right now. And I just think that was a tough loss for Georgia because the rest of their schedule does not look like a schedule where somebody goes undefeated. And if Alabama, if Georgia goes undefeated the rest of the way, you tip your cap and say you're wrong. But if you lost a game early in SEC play and you squeaked by Kentucky on the road and then you lost at Alabama and you're sitting there saying you got to go to Texas, to Ole Miss, and you still have Tennessee, most people will say you're going to drop another game.
Yeah. I would agree 100%. And on the flip side of that, that means, to your point, Georgia on the pretenders list, Ole Miss also on the pretenders list, joined with Oklahoma. And I still have LSU on that side of the list as well, just in the sense that you're losing a lot for the year defensively. But Jerry, there's a lot to be learned after this week, especially that Texas A&M Missouri game. Moving forward, I know that we're roughly, a week and a half out from the Texas-Oklahoma game, but you're getting closer to it. What in that game for Texas could you look at and say, all right, there's no more questions about their status in the contenders category because of what they did against Oklahoma in Dallas? This is because of what?
Offensive line plays at the level they did against Michigan. Okay. That, to me, is the deal. We said all year, there's 3 defensive fronts, 4 if you count A&M, that are really going to be good on this schedule that will tell you if the Texas offensive line is one of the top 2 or 3 in America. Michigan game, they passed that test against really good defensive front and linebackers. Oklahoma, week off. Venable's going to bring the heat. You know that. He's very good with his blitz disguises. If Texas offensive line turns in a high-level game, that's going to be one. And the second one for me is the Texas defensive front 7. If they play a sound game up front and sound, I mean, no self-inflicted, like no late hits on Hawkins, right? No hands to the face that gives them drives. Nothing that is big penalties that helps sustain Oklahoma drives. I think that's going to be a really good sign for Texas. You don't have questions about quarterback. You don't have questions about the skill and the ability to score the points. I think safeties have held up pretty well. I still wonder if somebody can beat Texas over the top at the corner position multiple times, but it's not going to be Oklahoma with their wide receiver injuries. Brennan Thompson and Petaway can run fast, but that's a lot different look than when you have Burks in the slot, Nick Anderson outside, and Big Jaden Gibson, and all those guys they had before the year. So that's what I'm looking to. I think the number one key, CJ, outside of turnovers in a rivalry game, is offensive line. If Texas offensive line turns in an Alabama 23 and Michigan 24 performance, I think Texas is going to be in a very good spot.
Yeah. The saying, defense travels, but offensive lines do as well. And even at home, you saw what happens, especially to Ole Miss a week ago, when the offensive line does not provide enough time or comfort for the quarterback. It's tough to move the ball in the SEC, and especially against Texas OU, that game magnifies errors and kind of those weak spots on teams more so than the common game. But Jerry, that about does it for this week's Texas versus the SEC episode here on Texas Football. Of course, we'll be back next week when we have a very fun conversation loaded up in the clip for us as well. But that'll do it for today. Of course, come find us at ontexasfootball.com. Gerry Hamilton, I'm CJ Vogel. Y'all have a good weekend and hook 'em.